The great hall of Ravensworth Hall had been hung with black from floor to rafter, and every soul beneath that black had come for the same two reasons: to bury a powerful old man, and to divide what he had left behind. The old Earl of Ravensworth was dead. His coffin lay upon a bier at the head of the hall, banked with white lilies, and around it the family had gathered in their finest mourning, which is to say, in their finest greed. For a great estate was about to change hands, and everyone in that room believed they already knew exactly how. At the center of it all stood Lord Reginald Ravensworth, the elder son, the heir, and beside him his wife, Lady Ophelia, resplendent in black silk and cold diamonds. They did not look like people in grief. They looked like people at a coronation. And there was one person in that hall upon whom every scornful eye kept settling: a young widow, in a plain, dark gown, standing quietly to one side, Lady Isadora Ravensworth, the widow of the old Earl's second son, Cassian, dead these 2 years. To the family she had never been anything but an embarrassment, a scholar's daughter, low-born of no fortune and no use, a burden they had tolerated only as long as they were forced to. "Look at her," Lady Ophelia murmured to a cousin, behind her fan, loud enough to carry. "Still here. One would think she'd have the decency to slink away before the will is read and spare herself the humiliation. There is nothing in it for her, of course, nothing at all." Isadora heard it, as she was meant to. She did not so much as turn her head. Mr. Halloway, the family solicitor, took his place at a small table before the coffin and cleared his throat, and the room began hungrily to settle. Reginald allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In a few minutes the estate would be his, whole and unquestioned, as it had been in all but name for years, and the troublesome widow and her 3 fatherless children would be shown, at last and forever, the door. And then, from the far end of the hall, the great doors opened. They did not open quietly. They swung wide with a boom that silenced every whisper, and cold gray daylight poured in. And framed in that light stood Lady Isadora's 3 children. And behind them, walking with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never in his life been told to wait, came a figure that made the entire assembly forget how to breathe. He wore the dress uniform of a general officer, gold at the collar and cuff a sword at his hip, decorations for valor across his breast that even the proudest lord in that room could not have purchased with his whole estate. His face was stern, weathered, and utterly without fear. And at his back, filing into the hall in 2 silent columns, came a squad of soldiers, real soldiers, king's men, who took up positions along the walls as though they owned them. The old steward, Barnes, came in at the general's shoulder, holding a locked strongbox against his chest. Mr. Halloway's assistant hurried in behind. And walking now at the very center of it all, no longer to one side, no longer with her eyes lowered, came the widow, Lady Isadora, with her children's hands in hers, and her chin level, and her gaze fixed, calm, and unblinking upon Lord Reginald Ravensworth. The heir's satisfied smile died on his face. The color drained from it, drop by drop, until he was as gray as the daylight, because Reginald, of all the people in that hall, was the only one who had reason to be afraid. And he had just understood 2 years too late that the widow he had dismissed as harmless had come back into his house at the head of an army. Every soul in that hall believed the day had come to cast out a penniless widow. Not one of them understood the truth, that she had not come to be cast out at all. She had come to bury one of them, and it was not the man in the coffin. Welcome to Crown and Ashes. Subscribe now and stay with me to the very end, because a reckoning that walks in behind a general and a squadron of the king's own soldiers is the kind that leaves nothing standing but the truth. To understand how a scholar's daughter came to stand in that hall, holding the fate of a great house in her hands, we must go back. Back to a house of learning in the capital, to 2 boys who became brothers. And to the quiet, gentle woman they both, in their different ways, would spend their lives protecting. In the heart of the capital, years before that black-hung hall, there stood a modest house that the great and the powerful were forever contriving reasons to visit. It belonged to Master Hale, the most respected scholar of his generation. He was a polymath of astonishing range, mathematics and law, history and languages, the movements of the stars, and the movements of markets. Ministers consulted him. Great families begged him to take their sons as pupils, and yet he lived plainly, taught brilliantly, and measured a man not by his blood, but by his mind and his character, which made him, in the eyes of the aristocracy, both indispensable and faintly scandalous. Master Hale had 2 children of his own. A son, Alexander, quick, disciplined, hungry for the world, and a daughter, Isadora, quiet, watchful, and possessed of a gentleness so deep and so calm that people found themselves, without knowing why, telling her their troubles. And into that house, as a boy, came a pupil named Cassian Ravensworth. Cassian was the second son of a great and cold northern earl, sent away young as unwanted second sons often were, to be educated far from home. He arrived at Master Hale's door, a guarded, lonely boy, and he found there the thing he had never had under his own father's roof, warmth. He and Alexander Hale took to one another at once. They were opposites who fit Alexander all fire and ambition, Cassian all patience and quiet cleverness, and within a season they were inseparable. Closer than most brothers of blood ever managed to be. They studied together, argued together, got into trouble together, and swore to one another the fierce, permanent loyalty that only boys can swear and only the best of men keep. When their studies ended, the 2 friends chose different roads. Alexander, born with nothing but his father's name and his own 2 hands, went into the army, to make his way by merit and courage, where birth could not carry him. Cassian went into the world of commerce, and here he made a choice that set him forever apart from his own family, for the Ravensworths, like most great houses, lived off the land, off rents wrung from tenants, off the slow, comfortable income of acres they had done nothing to earn. Cassian wanted no part of it. With the modest allowance his father grudgingly sent him, he did something no Ravensworth had ever dreamed of doing. He invested. He put his money into merchant fleets that sailed to the far side of the world, into the great banks of the capital, into ventures that rewarded a sharp mind and an honest reputation. Quietly, patiently, and entirely apart from his family, Cassian Ravensworth built a fortune of his own, one that owed nothing to any tenant's suffering, and that no one in his family ever suspected he possessed. But the thing that changed his life was not money. It was a woman. He had seen her 100 times across her father's house, Master Hale's quiet daughter, Isadora. But it was one ordinary afternoon, when she looked up from a book and smiled at him with that deep, unhurried gentleness of hers, that Cassian Ravensworth understood he was lost. He loved her from that moment, and completely. Not for a fortune, for she had none. Not for a title, for she had less than none. He loved her for her calm, for her kindness, for the still, steady goodness of her that made the whole loud, grasping world seem quieter and better when she was near. Alexander, laughing, gave his blessing to the match between his best friend and his beloved sister with both hands, and so the scholar's gentle daughter married the Earl's cast-off second son, and for a while far from the cold north. They were as happy as 2 people have ever been. They had 3 children, a son, Gideon, and some years later, twin daughters, Alice and Anna. Cassian adored them. He would have been content, I think, to live out his whole life quietly in the capital, prosperous and unknown, beside his gentle wife and his growing children. But blood calls in the end, and in the final years of the old Earl's life, blood called Cassian home. To understand what he found there, you must understand the house he had come from. The old Earl of Ravensworth, Lord Godfrey, was a hard man, powerful, cold, strong-willed, and sharp of mind even into old age. Long years before, he had handed over the day-to-day rule of the estate to his elder son and heir, Reynold, and had retreated into a stern and distant grandeur. But whatever his coldness, Lord Godfrey had one iron virtue. He was fair. In all his long life, he had never once cheated or oppressed the tenants who farmed his land. A hard landlord, yes, but an honest one, and he was, as it happened, the only member of the family who knew that his exiled second son had quietly built a fortune of his own in the capital, and who had come in his old age to respect him quietly for it. The elder son was another matter entirely. Reynold Ravensworth was clever, genuinely, dangerously clever, and utterly without conscience. Where his father's coldness was at least honest, Reynolds was a smiling mask laid over a patient, calculating greed. He did not merely want the estate. He wanted power, a great title, a seat among the men who ruled the kingdom, a ladder to climb all the way to the top. And a man climbing such a ladder needs money and needs fear, and will let nothing and no one stand in his way. So with his father old and failing, and the estate in his own two hands, Reynold had spent those years building something monstrous. Behind the respectable face of the Ravensworth estate, he had constructed a criminal empire. He lent money to his own tenants at crushing, ruinous interest, then seized their land when they could not pay, driving honest farming families into destitution. He went into partnership with bandits who terrorized the roads and with pirates who preyed upon the coast, taking his cut of their plunder, and he kept the whole rotten structure safe by owning the law itself. The local constables were in his pay, and the local magistrate, who happened to be the father of his own wife, Lady Ophelia, could be relied upon to see nothing, hear nothing, and convict no one that Reynold wished left alone. For years, no one had dared breathe a word against him. In that county, Reynold Ravensworth times was times the law. He had not counted on his brother coming home. Cassian's eyes were opened. In the end, not by a ledger, but by a child. He had come north, in those last years, only to sit with his dying father and one gray afternoon, needing air. He walked out alone along the old paths of his boyhood, and there at the edge of the wood, he saw a small boy, barefoot and in rags, scratching in the wet leaves for mushrooms, not for sport, but with the thin, desperate care of a child gathering the only supper his family would have. Cassian stopped, for there was something in that boy's face, the set of the jaw, the fair hair, the quick, shy eyes that reached back across 20 years and seized him by the heart. It was a face he had loved once. He spoke gently to the child and asked after his family, and what he heard turned his blood cold. A household fallen from modest comfort into starvation, a father crippled. A coming winter they did not expect to survive. Moved Cassian let the boy lead him home, to a wretched, leaking hovel at the wood's edge, and there on a straw pallet, with one leg twisted and badly healed beneath him, lay the man that small face had reminded him of, Jonah, the son of his father's old horse-groom, the friend of his childhood the boy Cassian had run wild with through these very woods, before the capital and its schools carried him away and let the long years swallow the friendship whole. The two men stared at one another, and then they wept, for the friendship and for the ruin of the man who had once been a laughing boy. For Jonah, Cassian learned, was only one of many. His family had been solvent, honest, hard-working, until Lord Reynolds' false loans and seized fields had bled them down to nothing. And when Jonah, in desperation, had dared to take his complaint to the law, Reynolds' men had caught him on a dark road and broken his leg with an iron bar, and left him in a ditch, a lesson to any other tenant who imagined the law was meant for the likes of them. Cassian's grief hardened, that day, into something colder and far more dangerous. He emptied his purse into his friend's hands. He swore he would see it made right. And then, because he knew his brother, and knew exactly what Reynold did to people who became inconvenient, he pressed still more coin upon them and begged them, for the sake of their children, to slip quietly away to some far place the Ravensworth name could not reach, and to stay hidden until he sent them word that it was safe. It was a small kindness, done in grief. He could not have known how much would one day turn upon it. After that day, Cassian could not look away. He returned again and again to sit at his ailing father's bedside, to make peace at the end with the cold old man who had sent him away. But now his eyes were open, and everywhere he looked he saw the same rot that had ruined Jonah. But Cassian had a merchant's eyes and an honest man's heart, and it did not take him long to see what everyone in that county had been too frightened to say aloud. He saw the ruined tenants. He heard the whispers. He followed the money the way he had spent his life following money, quietly and patiently. And thread by thread he uncovered the whole horror of what his brother had become, the usury, the seized farms, the bandits, the pirates, the bought magistrate. He even found, to his cold fury, evidence that some of the very pirates his brother did business with had been preying upon merchant ships not unlike his own. Cassian resolved to end it. He was not a violent man, but he was a determined one, and he began carefully to gather what he would need to bring his brother to justice, a justice that could not be bought in that corrupt little county, but only in the capital, before the crown. But Reynold was cleverer and colder than his honest brother ever imagined. A man who has done evil for years learns to smell danger on the wind, and Reynold had smelled it. He had noticed Cassian's questions, his long walks among the tenants, his quiet visits to ruined families, and he had set his own men to watch him. He did not know exactly how much his brother had learned, but he knew with cold certainty that Cassian had learned enough to be a threat. So first, Reynold tried the easy way. He came to his brother, and he did not bluster. He smiled, and he warned. "Go back to the capital, Cassian," he said softly. "Be a scholar. Marry your quiet little wife. Write your quiet little books, and never set foot in this county again. Because here, now, I am the law. I am the king of these lands, in all but name, and it would grieve me to have to remind you what happens to men who forget it." Any sensible man would have taken the warning and gone. But Cassian Ravensworth had his mother's honest heart and an unbending sense of right, and he would not abandon the ruined and the wronged to their fate. He refused. And so Reynold Ravensworth, who had never once let an obstacle stand in the way of his ambition, made his decision. His own brother would have to die. It was called a hunting accident. Lord Cassian Ravensworth, they said, had been thrown from his horse in the deep woods and struck his head upon a stone, and by the time he was found, nothing could be done. The truth was far uglier. Reynold's men caught Cassian alone in the forest, far from any help, and it did not go the way they had planned. For Cassian was no soft scholar. He was quick and strong, and he had learned, at the same academy that trained his soldier friend Alexander, how to handle himself in a fight. And he fought them like a cornered lion. He hurt them. He very nearly broke free. But he was one man against many alone in the dark. And in the end, the numbers told, and honest Cassian Ravensworth died on the cold ground of the woods he had played in as a boy. There was an inquest, of course conducted by the local magistrate, Lady Ophelia's father, who found with grave and practiced sorrow that it had been a tragedy and no one's fault at all. And Reynold was certain there had been no witnesses. He was wrong. Hidden among the trees that night, frozen with terror, was a ragged man with a badly healed leg, Jonah, the groom's son, the friend Cassian had come to save. And Jonah saw all of it, the men, the faces, the whole black truth of the murder. He told no one. He gathered his family and vanished into hiding, carrying the most dangerous secret in the county locked behind his teeth, and waited for 2 long years, for the day it might, at last, be safe to speak. Isidora did not believe it. She had known her husband's seat on a horse for 12 years. He did not fall. But she was a stranger in that cold country, a scholar's daughter with no power and no allies, surrounded by people who wished her gone, and her husband was in his grave, and her 3 children were small, and their eyes were on her. And there was one more cruelty. Her brother Alexander, the one man in the world with the strength to have stood beside her, was not there. He was a soldier, and soldiers do not come when they are needed, but when they are released. He was away on a distant campaign at the very frontier of the kingdom when the news reached him, weeks late, and though it broke something in him that never quite healed, he could not come. He could not bury his best friend. He could not protect his sister. All he could do from 1,000 miles away was grieve. For the brother of his heart and for the sister he had failed. So Isidora buried her husband alone, among people who despised her, and began the loneliest years of her life. With Cassian gone, the family dropped even the pretense of tolerance. To Reynold and Ophelia, the widow and her 3 children were now nothing but an inconvenience hangers on with no claim and no worth, to be housed grudgingly in the coldest wing of the hall and reminded daily of their uselessness. Ophelia led the cruelty, as she led everything, with a smile. She mocked Isidora's plain gowns and her scholar's manners. She mocked the children. And she was, though she would never have admitted it, quietly consumed with envy, for no matter how she sneered, she could not make herself the equal of that calm, gentle woman. Beside Isidora's stillness, Ophelia felt loud and gaudy and cheap, and she hated her for it. But it was crueler even than contempt. Reynold did not keep the widow and her children out of any sense of duty. He kept them because he could not be certain how much his brother had told his wife before he died. So for 2 years he held them there in the cold hall under his own roof and his own eye, with servants set to watch her every step and report it. Isidora was not a guest in that house. She was a prisoner who did not yet know she was one, and she made herself more dangerous still, for she had never once believed the story of the accident, and quietly in a house full of her enemies, she began to pull at the very threads her husband had died pulling at, never once dreaming that in doing so she was walking, step by step, down the same road that had led Cassian to his grave. And yet she was not entirely without a friend. The old steward, Barnes, had served the house of Ravensworth all his life, and he had loved only one master in it, old Lord Godfrey, whom he had served faithfully for 50 years, and whose fairness he shared. And Barnes, it turned out, knew everything, for in the last years, the old Earl had begun to suspect his elder son, quietly. Using the one servant he trusted completely, Godfrey had set Barnes to investigate, and Barnes had done it, patiently and in terror, and had gathered into a single locked strongbox the proof of all of Reynold's crimes, the forged loans, the seized deeds, the letters to bandits and pirates, and most damning of all the evidence that Cassian's accident had been murder. Barnes held all of it, and Barnes had said nothing, because Barnes was an old man who knew exactly how powerful and how ruthless Reynold was, and knew that a single word spoken to the wrong person in that county would see him dead in a ditch and the evidence burned. For 2 years, Reynold's watch over her had been almost perfect, but then, at last, 2 things changed. His old father finally died, which meant the inheritance and the great title Reynold had schemed and killed to possess were now within his grasp, and a man who believes he has already won grows careless, certain of his victory. Reynold loosened his grip on the grieving widow at exactly the wrong moment, and into that narrow crack in his guard, help began, quietly, to slip. One night, afraid for her, the old steward came to Isidora in secret. He begged her to stop, to give up trying to prove what had happened to her husband. "You will only get yourself killed, my lady," he whispered, "and your little ones with you. There is nothing to be done here. Go back to the capital, take the children, and go, and live." For the old earl, in a last act of quiet conscience, had secretly settled upon Isidora and her children a sum of money enough to live in modest comfort in the capital, far from this cursed place for the rest of their lives. Godfrey could not undo what his son had done, but he could, at least, give the widow a door out. Isidora looked at the frightened old man, and she asked him the question that changed everything. "Why can nothing be done, Barnes? If you have proof, why can it not be brought before the law? Because in this county—" "My lady," Barnes said bitterly, "times is the law. The constables are his. The magistrate is his own wife's father. There is no court within 100 miles that would hear a word against Lord Reginald Ravensworth. To fight him here is to die here. That is why I beg you, do not fight him here at all." And Isidora, quiet, gentle Isidora, looked at the old man for a long moment, and then she said the thing that Barnes had never known. "My brother," she said softly, "is Major General Alexander Hale." Barnes stared at her. He knew, vaguely, as everyone knew, that the widow's people were scholars and soldiers, a phrase the family used as an insult to mean times nobodies. He had heard, once or twice, that she had a brother in the army. He had assumed, as everyone assumed, that the brother was some minor officer of no consequence, off in some distant garrison. He had not known that the brother was Alexander Hale, the general whose name had run through the whole kingdom that very year. For Alexander Hale had, only months before, won a great and famous victory. He had shattered a fleet of raiders that had long menaced the crown's shipping, a triumph so complete that the king himself had raised him a scholar's son with no drop of noble blood, to the rank of major general. He was not a minor officer in a distant garrison. He was one of the most powerful and celebrated soldiers in the realm, a man who answered not to any bought county magistrate, but to the crown itself. And crimes of piracy, collusion with the very sort of sea raiders Reginald had partnered with, were not a squabble for a local court. They were a matter of the security of the kingdom. They fell squarely within the authority of a general of the king's forces. Old Barnes understood, all at once, that the door had opened, that there was, after all, one power in the world that Reginald Ravensworth's money could not buy, and his bought magistrates could not silence. That night, with tears in his eyes, the old steward unlocked his strongbox and placed the whole of the evidence, everything, 2 years of it, the proof of every crime, including murder, into the hands of Lady Isidora Ravensworth. And there was one thing that no strongbox could ever hold something more powerful than any document: a living witness. For in that same brief, careless window, Jonah crept out of his long hiding and came to Lady Isidora in the dark. And in a low, broken voice, the ruined friend her husband had saved told her at last what he had seen that night in the woods, the men, the faces, the murder of the man she loved. Now she did not hold only the proof of Reynolds' crimes on paper. She held a witness to the very worst of them. And so, that very night, Isidora sat down and wrote a letter to her brother, and she entrusted it together with the strongbox of evidence to old Barnes himself, to carry in person to Major General Alexander Hale. Such things were far too dangerous to send by any other hand. But Reginald Ravensworth missed very little that happened in his own house. When the old steward slipped out to the stables and rode away alone into the dark, Reynolds' suspicion woke at once, and he sent riders after him with orders to make certain the old man never spoke to anyone ever again. Barnes was old, and his horse was not young, and by the small hours of the night it was failing beneath him, stumbling and blown, while behind him, through the dark, came the drumming of pursuing hooves. He would not have lived to see the dawn but for a stranger who was not a stranger at all. For in a hidden hut off that very road there lived a family in flight, the family of Jonah, the groom's son, the ruined friend of Cassian's boyhood, whom Cassian had saved and sent quietly away. Jonah heard the horses in the night, and understood in an instant what they were, and what the old steward's desperate flight must mean. So when Reynolds' men came pounding up out of the dark, demanding which way the old man had gone, Jonah, with a poor man's dull, frightened face that hid a quick and loyal heart, pointed them down the wrong road entirely, and sent them galloping off into the empty night. Then he brought out the one thing of worth his ruined family still owned in all the world, their last horse, and pressed its reins into the trembling hands of the old steward. For Lord Cassian's sake, he said, ride, and do not stop until it is finished. And so upon a poor man's borrowed horse, old Barnes made the rest of that long and frightened journey, the letter in his coat and the strongbox never once out of his grip. And when at last he reached Major General Alexander Hale and placed them both before him, the men under the general's command said afterward that they had never seen their commander's face go so still. It told him everything. That Cassian, the brother of his heart, the boy he had sworn to protect and had failed, had not fallen from a horse, that he had been murdered by his own brother to hide a crime, that the murderer had escaped all justice because he owned the law of his county, and that Alexander's sister, his gentle Isadora, and her 3 small children had lived for 2 years as prisoners in the house of the very man who had killed her husband. Alexander Hale had wept for Cassian once, from 1,000 miles away, unable to act. He would not be unable to act again. He requested and was granted the crown's authority for the matter. Touching piracy and treasonous collusion with the kingdom's enemies was well within his commission. He gathered a squadron of soldiers. He sent for Mr. Halloway, the family solicitor, who, it emerged, had been waiting 2 long years for exactly this, for he too held a secret. And then Major General Alexander Hale rode north, to the cold country where his best friend lay murdered, to keep at last the promise he had made to a boy in a scholar's house so many years before. He arrived on the very day of the old Earl's funeral, the day of the reading of the will, which is how a scorned widow came to walk back into Ravensworth Hall at the head of an army, with her children's hands in hers, to look upon the face of the man who had murdered her husband, and to watch his satisfied smile turn, at last, to ash. For a long moment after those doors boomed open, no one in that black-hung hall moved. Then Reynolds, recovering, did what men like Reynolds always do. He tried to bluster. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice not quite steady. "Soldiers? In a house of mourning? Who is this man? I'll have the magistrate on you. This is my house, my land." "Your magistrate," said Major General Alexander Hale, in a voice that had commanded men through cannon fire, and did not have to rise to fill the room, "has no authority over an officer of the crown. And your land, Lord Reynolds, is precisely the matter we have come to discuss." He turned, unhurried, to the solicitor. "Mr. Halloway, I believe you have a will to read, the true one." Mr. Halloway, quiet, mild Mr. Halloway, who had said little and smiled gently and respected the truth all his life, and whom the old Earl had trusted above every other man precisely for that, rose to his feet. "I do," he said. "Lord Godfrey came to me in the last weeks of his life, sir, when he had at last learned the truth of what his elder son had done, to the tenants, and to his second son, Cassian. It broke him. He could not undo it. But he could do this. He drew out a document, heavy with the old Earl's seal. This is the true and final will of Lord Godfrey Ravensworth, superseding all others. And it does not leave this estate to Lord Reynolds. A sound went through the hall like wind, through a field of wheat. It places the entire estate, Halloway read, into a trust to be administered in the interest of justice and restitution by the one person my son Cassian trusted above all others, his widow, Lady Isidora. Its first and binding charge is that every tenant defrauded, every family ruined, every debt falsely called in upon these lands shall be found and repaid and made whole, and the rightful inheritance of my son Cassian's line shall pass, protected, to his son Gideon, when he comes of age. Reynold was on his feet now, shaking. That will is a forgery. My father would never that woman has poisoned. Sit times down, said Alexander Hale, and something in the two soft words put Reynold back into his chair like a felled tree. Then Isidora spoke, for the first time since she had entered, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that silent hall. You called my husband's death an accident, she said to Reynold. You had your father-in-law sign the paper that made it so. But my husband did not fall from his horse, Reynold. You know it. And now, so does everyone. Old Barnes stepped forward and set the strongbox upon the solicitor's table and opened it, and one by one, Mr. Halloway laid its contents out for the whole assembly to see. The forged loans, the seized deeds of a dozen ruined families, the letters in Reynolds' own hand, to the leaders of the bandit gangs and the pirate crews arranging the division of stolen goods, and, at the last, the evidence that the hunting accident had been no accident at all. And then Isidora did the one thing Reynold had never dreamed possible. You believed there was no one to see what your men did in those woods, she said. You were wrong. And from the back of the hall, safe for the first time in 2 years, behind a wall of the king's soldiers, a ragged limping man stepped forward. Jonah, the groom's son, the only living soul who had watched Lord Cassian die. He looked his old friend's murderer full in the face, and in a voice that shook but did not break, he began to name every man he had seen that night, beginning with the one who had given the orders, Earl of Ravensworth, who had built his whole kingdom upon the certainty that the powerless could always be silenced, went white to the lips. The one witness he could never have imagined a broken peasant he had ruined and forgotten had been alive all along. Collusion with pirates who have preyed upon the king's shipping, said Alexander Hale, and now, at last, his cold voice did rise, and it was terrible. That is not a matter for a county magistrate, Lord Reynold. That is a matter of treason against the crown, and it is precisely the matter I am commissioned to answer. You built your little kingdom on the certainty that no law could touch you here. He looked, for one contemptuous instant, at the pale and shrinking figure of Ophelia's father, the local magistrate cowering now among the guests. You forgot that there is a larger law than the one you bought. He nodded to his soldiers. They took Earl of Ravensworth by the arms in that black-hung hall, before his whole assembled family, before the coffin of the father he had deceived, and they bound him. He did not go quietly. He raged, and he threatened, and he wept, and he named the magistrate and the constables who had served him, condemning them all with his own screaming mouth, and none of it mattered in the slightest, because for the first time in his life, Earl of Ravensworth stood before a power his money could not reach. Lady Ophelia, watching her husband dragged away and her father exposed, sank down into her cold black silk with her hand pressed to her mouth, and could not meet the eyes of the gentlewoman she had spent 2 years despising. Earl of Ravensworth was taken to the capital and tried, not by a bought county magistrate, but before the crown, for murder, for fraud, and for treasonous dealing with the enemies of the kingdom. There was no fortune large enough to save him from the weight of what was in that strongbox. His corrupt magistrate and his bought constables fell with him, one after another, and the county that had lived so long in fear of the Ravensworth name breathed, at last, freely. But here is the thing that the whole county remembered ever after, the thing that made them speak of Lady Isidora not with pity, but with reverence. She did not keep the estate for herself, and she had no wish to rule over that cold hall. As executor of the old Earl's true will, she set about the work it had charged her with, and then she went far beyond it. The fortune of a great Earl is a vast thing, and setting right even years of a wicked man's cruelty cost only a small corner of it. Every farm Reynold had falsely seized, she returned to the family it had been stolen from. Every fraudulent debt she cancelled. Every ruined household she made whole again. And then she went further than any will had asked. She lowered the rents and the land taxes upon every tenant across the whole estate, so that no family on those acres would ever again be squeezed to breaking. And in the heart of the village, she built out of the estate's own wealth an infirmary, a place where the sick and the poor could be cared for without charge, the first the county had ever known. But she did not stay to preside over it. The great hall itself she left in the faithful hands of old Barnes, to keep and to care for, and she set honest men to manage the lands justly, in her son's name and for the tenants' good. Then she gathered her 3 children and took them home, back to the capital, back to her father's house of books and warmth. For there she could look after the honest fortune her husband had built and keep it whole and growing for their future. And there her son and her twin daughters could have the fine education that Cassian had always dreamed of giving them. And yet every summer, without fail, she came back. Once a year the widow's carriage would appear upon the north road, bringing her and the children to the estate that would one day be Gideon's, so that they might know the land, and the people upon it, and walk among the tenants their father had died trying to protect. And the county that had once trembled at the name of Ravensworth came, in time, to watch for that summer carriage with joy, for it meant that the woman who had given them back their lives had returned once more to see that all was well. The silenced had been given back their voices, the powerless had been made whole, and her son Gideon would one day inherit the Ravensworth lands not as the seat of a cruel dynasty, but as a trust to be kept for the good of every soul upon them, exactly as his grandfather had, too late, come to wish. Major General Alexander Hale stayed until it was finished, until the last tenant was made whole, and the last of Reynolds' men was in chains. And on the morning before he rode back to his regiment, he stood with his sister in the cold churchyard, at the grave of the friend he had failed to save. "I should have come," he said quietly. It was the thing he had not been able to say for 2 years, when Cassian died. "When they were hurting you, I should have been here. I was his brother in everything but blood, and I let him lie in the ground unavenged, and I let them treat you like his hard soldier's voice broke. I am sorry, Isadora." And his gentle sister took his hand, the way she had taken it when they were children in their father's house, and she said, "You came, Alexander. In the end, you came. And because you came, no one will ever hurt them again." She looked down at the grave. He knew you would. Whatever they did to him, Cassian died certain of one thing, that if his family were ever in danger, his brother would come for them from the ends of the earth. You did not fail him. You kept the only promise that ever mattered. The general wept, then, without shame, in the cold morning for the friend of his heart and for the sister he had saved. Lady Isadora took her 3 children home to the capital in the end, back to her father's house of books and warmth. Far from the cold country that had taken so much from her, old Barnes, freed at last from his long terror, went with them, and lived out his final years honored and at peace, having done, before the end, the one brave thing his whole life had been building toward. And in the years that followed, when people spoke of the great scandal of the Ravensworths, the murdering heir dragged from a funeral by the king's own soldiers, the widow who gave back an estate instead of keeping it, they came, always to the same conclusion, that the old Earl had been right, at the last, about the difference between a great house and a good one. That Reynold Ravensworth had possessed everything, the name, the fortune, the power, the certainty, and had left the world nothing but ruin and a hated grave. And that his despised younger brother Cassian, the second son, the exile, the man who married a scholar's daughter for her gentle heart and built an honest fortune no one ever saw, had left behind the only things that ever truly last: a wife who loved him enough to fight 2 years in silence for the truth of his death, 3 children who would grow up free and safe and good, a brother who kept faith with him beyond the grave, and a whole county of ordinary, powerless people who got their lives back because one honest man had refused to look away. For real justice in the end is not the seizing of power, nor even the punishing of the guilty. It is the giving back of a voice to those who have been silenced, the quiet, patient work of making the wronged whole again. And that, and not the cold acres of Ravensworth Hall, is the only inheritance worth leaving behind.